Hello there, everyone. It's Zanril. Dungeons are underground adventure areas I've been building since Sauron's Retreat back in October of 2017. But what most players don't know is that I've been making these dungeons before I even joined Simplex. Even if you're unfamiliar with the dungeons on Simplex, I'll be talking about those as well. So come with me as I explore my history of dungeons, starting with the primitive era. My love for building dungeons in Minecraft started during my teenage years playing 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons with friends in 2011. As the game master, I liked that I could create top down views of anything from a region of the world, towns, and of course, levels in a dungeon. When I started making dungeons in Minecraft, I was making them for one friend from the D&D group, a few months after we had lost interest in the game. I'd like to keep his real name a secret, so I will use the next best thing I think him and I would be appropriate to use. It's the name of one of his D&D characters, a human barbarian who was as straightforward as he was, Gondo. He was brutish, asked me permission to do just about everything whenever he came over to visit me with lines like, permission to use your restroom? Loyal, and perverted whenever he could get away with it. I copied the seed of another friend's short-lived 1.2.3 LAN server and used it for my dungeon crawling world. I recall wanting to reuse this seed because I was already familiar with the layout of the terrain and biomes. It would have been better than starting from scratch, so I copied it. The first dungeon I made, the Dungeons of Faithful Slaughter, was mimicking the output of a random dungeon generator from a website called Donjon. I first drew the dungeon on grid paper, and during my spare time, likely during my cafeteria period or whenever teachers would declare it to be a free period to do whatever we wanted in class, I built the layout of the dungeon one to one into Minecraft, filled some of the rooms with decorations going solely off of the name I gave the room, kept all the floors, walls, and ceiling stone, and then called it a day. When it was ready, I equipped Gondo with some gear and guided him to the dungeon entrance from a hub area I created in the world. He took a headbanger down the stairs and began exploring, lighting up the darkness which acted as a fog of war. Finding all the rooms, and then returning to the hub area was the sole objective of all my early dungeons, like my next dungeon on this list. The Uncanny Mines of Mist was the second dungeon built in a Extreme Hills biome, which was the first to have a theme, was not plagiarized from Donjon's random dungeon generator, and the shortest in length since there wasn't much to explore. I didn't do anything creative with this dungeon beyond having a minecart station, outposts for those minecarts, and a furnace room. There's also this weird stone brick face with a hand reaching to grab, an oak pressure plate in front of it, and a piston door mouth. If you were able to find the lever to the door that would unlock it, there was a sign on the other side saying, "I can almost reach it." Finding the lever was pointless, since after you open the door, it goes back to the front of the stone brick face. I imagined a statue or robot deactivated before it was able to reach something, and its face and hand were all that were mined out. I was excited to move on to my next dungeon since I didn't believe this dungeon had much design space to work with. I initially didn't know where to place this chronologically, but since the world I have containing these dungeons is a backup, and all others past this point are lost to time, this is a scrapped third dungeon I made a floor plan for and built the entrance for, but abandoned because I didn't know how I could make an adventure around a prison interesting or fun, so I moved on. Dreadwater Catacombs was half randomly generated, half my own doing. Its entrance was located in the middle of a swamp surrounded by water. The small castle resembles a small keep from the game Stronghold 2, with a ruined look to fit the swamp better and make it look abandoned. I built something that resembled this entrance in a creative world of mine. After finding the ladder behind the painting in the sunken keep, you entered a simple sewer area. Once you found the door within it, You entered the actual dungeon with 5 empty rooms, 4 filled, and once again, I'm using skinny, 1 block wide tunnels to connect everything, but this time there is less dead ends compared to the dungeons of Faithful Slaughter. Twilight Hall was named after a song from the band Blind Guardian because I was listening to them often at the time. Instead of using a randomly generated name that Don John gave me, I wanted to use my music collection as a source for the name of my next dungeon. Even though it may look generated, it's not. I imitated previous dungeons I've made with all the pointless rims and such. The big feature I wanted for this was 3 long hallways. That's it. Although not in the original floor plan, I remember making this nether portal with glass behind it to make it look cool. Another feature is that it loops back onto itself. So if Gondo either went clockwise or counterclockwise, he would always end up back at the entrance. The Haunted Chambers of Karuk the Bloody Savage was the deviant of the bunch. Unlike all my previous dungeons, this one's floor plan was doodled on yellow line paper, unlike the grid paper I had been using. The back of the yellow sheet was a table showing a room number, what mobs would spawn in them, and how many. I used the floor plans as a reference and stuck to it as close as I could. The incoherent structure of the rooms remained, but one thing I remember the most when making this was mobs spawning in rooms whenever you wanted to enter them. The new functionality that dispensers got was spawn eggs shot from them would spawn mobs in front of them. This dungeon had a whopping 30 rooms, but 17 of them had dispensers in them for the purpose of spawning mobs in them when you entered. To trigger their spawning, I made all rooms have iron doors with levers to open them, which also triggered the mobs to spawn. I left the dungeon unlit, so I could have hostile mobs spawn in naturally to create combat counters in addition to these new encounters I set up. I ran through this dungeon with Gondo, and it was action-packed, only slowing down when I had to show Gondo how to get to the southern half of the dungeon through the kitchen that had the rest of the rooms. I had solely relied on darkness to spawn mobs, but now that I can spawn them in a controlled manner, which wasn't possible before, I made this dungeon my biggest yet. These next 4 dungeons were made with this new power to spawn mobs from dispensers in a separate world I dubbed Fablecraft. I ditched the idea of imitating generated floor plans from Don John for my dungeons, like with what I did with everything we've seen so far. It's barely worth mentioning, but I made this unnamed example dungeon as the first of this world to get both Gondo and I warmed up to build and raid dungeons again, since we had gone on a year hiatus. The Demon Web Pits, the realm of the Spider Queen Loth in D&D, and also the name of this dungeon, was going to be a spider-themed dungeon, but I encountered a critical problem. Spiders spawned from dispensers would inconsistently spawn in the wall or floor and suffocate in it. I didn't have this problem with humanoid mobs like the zombie, but normal and cave spiders had this issue. When I went to test the first room of this dungeon and discovered this problem would ruin the concept, I quickly abandoned the idea of this dungeon and moved on. The Crypts of Decay, a desert-themed dungeon that was a catacomb for the dead. I carved out almost all of the dungeon and replaced all the stone with smooth stone, which was a first for me. This dungeon also introduced puzzles, the 2 of which were a simple 3-lever lock similar to what you see in jungle temples, and an iron door with 2 wooden pressure plates that require you to put an item on both plates to proceed. I built this with some idea of what I wanted to do and took advantage of the caves and ravine I found while I dug off the first part of the dungeon. Unlike all my previous dungeons, this one had an end to it you had to reach. After the door puzzle, there was a ravine with a chest room on one end and a lever at the other, which you had to flip to raise a block out of the lava pool that allowed you to parkour to the chest room. An oversight of mine was including a fire resistance potion in the chest nearby the lava pool as loot, but after pointing that out, Gondo carried on without using it since I wanted him to explore the last bit of the dungeon the way I intended.
Is that your castle?
Well, oh, no. It's theirs, I guess you could say. I forget what I called it. Lair of Solo, the Mad God. Like the previous dungeon I built, I did not drop a floor plan beforehand to follow. For this dungeon, I had shot footage of Gondo and myself raiding this dungeon I made, following him around like a companion and letting him figure out stuff on his own, unless he was stuck.
Here's a question. Where's the rest of the other stuff?
Oh, we missed back here. Where I guess the altar was.
Is that everything?
No, actually. Let's go back to the throne room. You're tore up. I don't know how that arrow goes, but anyway, over here. Anyway, over here.
Over where?
Behind the throne. Yeah, right here. For once, there was lore behind this dungeon. The ruler of this dungeon, Sulla, was a cat owner and loved cooking with his blind advisor who would teach Sulla new cooking recipes every day. Sulla's cat, Buttons, went missing one day, and then so did he. The advisor would check everywhere in the dungeon for him, but failed to find him. He could check everywhere but behind the throne room where a kitchen is situated. Sola always opened the door for both of them to access, and the blind advisor didn't know how to open the door, despite it being a simple button. A lore book in the kitchen written by Sola claims that the advisor would cook his own food badly during his lessons so he could eat Sola's food instead. Oh, and the advisor killed the cat Buttons. So Sola's reaction was to expand the dungeon from the kitchen behind the throne room and put his own kitchen at the very end of this expansion, far away from the original, so the advisor could never reach him to bother him. This dungeon more closely resembles what I built up to this point with Silvarm Containment Site. The named rooms are closer together and hallways are shorter and less abundant. As a bonus mention for the Fablecraft era, if Fablecraft continued, this was going to be the next dungeon I was going to make and revisit the mining theme I had used for my second dungeon, but never got to it. After Fablecraft, I had made another small, unnamed example dungeon that would use command blocks to summon mobs instead of spawn eggs from dispensers. Afterward, I would create the Vaults of Anti-Life. At this point, building and raiding my dungeons was no longer a regular occurrence for us, and this was a one-off raid for the sake of closure. I knew full well that Gondo would go through this in its incomplete state, but I didn't care, since this was the end for us. I can't remember the reason why we quit, but I suspect Gondo was burnt out, and despite the promising aspect of being able to spawn mobs in with command blocks, making the dungeon replayable, and my evolving dungeon layouts ever since I stopped trying to make dungeons be random to mimic a generator, Gondo was rightfully exhausted. He experienced most of what I had to offer, and he was done raiding. So far, we've gone through the primitive era, the Fablecraft era, and now on to the Simplex era. Because of their recency, I have much more info to share about the dungeons built in this era. By the time I built my first dungeon on Simplex in 2018, it had been 6 years since I created one. It all started in August when I responded to Sneaky Kitty's idea of building a maze under St. Lucifer's Cathedral built by Silda 4 in Halloween Town. I responded to this by pitching the idea of a dungeon build competition. Participants would create 3 rooms in a dungeon that would either challenge the players with a puzzle or monster spawner, or be just for show. Kitty got Silda's okay to build under it and suggested that I could, as another option, make it under Kygot's Tower, a build I had made in Halloween Town the year prior. I considered it, since I had already established some lore with the tower already. I could expand upon it, but just a day later, I would ignore that idea and express my disliking of building the dungeon under Silda's cathedral and the tower because I felt the need to conform to the theme of those builds, and I didn't want that. I wanted to work with a clean slate. At the same time, I moved away from this being a build competition into a dungeon players rated after Trick or Treat had ended. Halloween Town had an expansion this year to the swamp east of it. I claimed it as my own, calling it the Witchlight Marsh, and intended to scout the underground of it to find monster spawners and then start building the dungeon. Kitty would use spectator mode to find them for me and saving me time in the process. It was then I started digging and building the dungeon of Sauron's Retreat on my own then. Fast forward to the middle of September, and most of the rooms had been completed. It was then I was put under distress by the presence of bed bugs in my home. I had been laid off until my employer confirmed with the service I would hire to professionally remove them that they were gone. I had put most of my belongings into trash bags or plastic totes so the exterminators could treat them. My computer had been packed away, so I was left without anything to play Minecraft on. The rest of September and most of October would be put towards getting rid of those bloodsuckers. In the meantime, I had used my local library's computer lab to contact Sneaky Kitty and relay my plans to her, hoping that she would be able to complete the 5 remaining rooms that I wanted to build, and she delivered. I would have finished what I started with the library computers, but due to their restrictions, I couldn't install anything to get back on Simplex. With the bed bugs gone, I returned to Simplex on the 22nd of October, 2 days before Trick or Treat would start. I would catch up with what Sneaky Kitty had built, scrambled to build the rest of what I saw missing, and somehow finish the dungeon on time for everyone to experience it on the 24th. 2019 would be a time I would be without a computer again and would employ the help of Chew Imperium, or Chew for short, to make some updates to it. The most major change was the creation of a shortcut near the entrance of the barracks to the magma chamber. I learned last year that its placement was a design flaw, but I didn't want to move it at all, so the next best thing was to make backtracking it to it easier. There were other minor updates to the dungeon I wanted to make too, that I outlined in a text file and guided Chew until they were all completed, on the 11th of October. Building dungeons in survival mode and on a server like this influenced how I build this dungeon and the ones after it. Previously, I had built dungeons for a single person, but now I was building it for random people to experience in survival mode, which influenced its design and future dungeons like it I would make. Also notable, before we move on, is the update to Minecraft's textures that happened upon the release of 1.14. Sauron's Retreat would be the last dungeon I built that had the classic texture still around. The Tomb of Silence was going to be part of a series of dungeons I made for my shop to earn diamonds. I used a pay to access model, meaning you pay a fixed price, and I grant the permissions necessary to you to enjoy exploring it. I finished the dungeon on the 21st of March 2020, although its start date is more unknown to me without wasting my time looking through my chat logs. My earliest screenshot of it was on February of the 18th. Based on my progress, I feel like I would have started sometime in January, but it's possible it could have been earlier. The 26th of October 2019 is a possible start date since I have that date on a sign above where I had the dungeon listed in my shop at the time. Unlike my previous dungeon, I did not want to build this around monster spawners, but more non-combat challenges. Before entering the dungeon, a village area was situated outside its entrance. It served no purpose other than for flavor, but it would have been strangely barren without it. It didn't seem right to me to have this dungeon entrance be out in the middle of nowhere, so I made this area as a optional area to explore. All buildings are home to some kind of profession, and the interiors of such reflect that, although I could have done better with some more than others. My goal with this dungeon was to make it both a headquarters for necromancers that was more caretakers of the dead than evil as usually portrayed, an underground tomb, and funeral home. I chose stone brick again as the main building blocks for this dungeon. I was looking for a color that was depressing. I chose dark yellow, but the closest I got was yellow terracotta to accommodate the stone brick. Anything related to the necromancer's headquarters or funeral home parts included cyan colored blocks. Looking back, I would have really liked to use the nether based warped wood type, but it wouldn't come until 1.16, after the server would have undergone a reset. Its biggest design flaw was its replayability. Once you knew the secret to get to the end of the dungeon quickly, you could finish it from start to finish in a couple minutes. It's Simplex 2, and Shu Imperium, the event manager, was on track to reconstruct Halloween Town from Simplex's first world. Since Sauron's Retreat was in it, I was concerned what they would do with it. Building it as is would have meant the same problems of the dungeon would have been recreated, and the rooms with the monster spawners would have been left without challenge. So I intervened and expressed interest in remaking it into Volmog's Retreat instead of Chu rebuilding the original. I started building on the 6th of July 2021. It was the same as it was in Sauron's Retreat, but with black stone and red sandstone blocks. I wanted the castle to blend in better with the theme of Halloween Town, so I chose those blocks to build with. I wanted to use those blocks for the rest of the dungeon, but since I was in such low supply of the block, I switched to using stone brick over the black stone for the underground sections. The most disruptive part of the dungeon's development came on the 5th of September, where I was being forced to move the dungeon's castle keep south onto an artificial hill. I was not happy about this, since I would have to go back and make the staircase down to the dungeon's first room again, when I have since moved past that point a month ago. Lucid Flight would handle the move, but I wouldn't be available until the 14th to do it with him. Disaster would strike after the transfer was completed when they would screw up on a rollback. Without restoration, I would have been set back to near where I started. Luckily, they were able to recover my progress, but what couldn't be restored was the state I had set note blocks to. So I'd have to go back and tune note blocks how I liked them a second time. I announced the completion of Volmog's retreat on the 19th of October 2021. I made an entire developer diary for this dungeon, which I will link in the video description for a more detailed day to day look at my progress working on this thing. The 16th of November 2021 would be the beginning of my third attempt at a mine themed dungeon. With the help of another player, Pyromancer22, a location was found and I began building on the 21st. The plethora of monster spawners made this dungeon destined to be combat focused. 7 cave spider spawners, 1 zombie spawner, and 1 skeleton spawner. I had started up a shop to sell access to this dungeon, the same as the Tomb of Silence, but the business never panned out. I felt burnt out all the time due to one puzzle room in particular that had 4 doors and 4 switches that would open more than one door, and a dripstone cave area after that, which was going to host 2 cave spider spawners that you would pass while you moved through it. There were some redstone bugs I struggled with, and I lacked vision with the dripstone cave, so I lost my motivation. It wasn't all for naught, though. I still had a great time experimenting with spawn-centric rims, and I even reused the 4-door puzzle in a future dungeon. The 4th of February 2022 would be when my progress would stall, and my last entry in my journal documenting my progress on completing this dungeon was on the 11th of July 2022. I ended up dropping this project despite how much I did up to this point. Like with Volmog's Retreat, I also have a journal going over the development of this dungeon in particular, and I will also link that below. Revitalized with time, my newfound vigor to build another dungeon was found in the thought of remaking the Tomb of Silence, but in Halloween Town. The rework for Volmog's Retreat turned out great, so why not for my only other completed dungeon I made on Simplex? I'd go back to Chew and propose a remake to the Tomb of Silence, but in Halloween Town on the 10th of August 2022. The project area was designated and accepted the very next day. Like with Volmog's Retreat, this dungeon was totally remade with a new coat of paint, its theme fleshed out, reimagined puzzles, and new challenges. I reused as much as I could from the original to save time building and as a homage to some parts of the original, but some sacrifices had to be made, and clearly bad ideas were cut or remade. I would complete the dungeon on the 10th of October, where I would have Boo87D test run the dungeon to finalize it. I'd finally move out all my shulkers and stuff on the 18th and would open to the public on the 30th of October 2022. Renamed to the Catacombs of Silence, this turned out to be my most popular dungeon yet. Upon Trick or Treat concluding, I recall most of the server having done or currently going through this thing. I was on standby to help people in case they got stuck or lost, but I felt I made everything easy enough that shouldn't have been a problem. At last, the final and most recent dungeon I've made, Sylphestum Containment Site. This was not built standalone, but a part of a anniversary celebration area, but I won't be talking about that here since it has its own separate history. Not too relevant to the dungeon, but I will mention that construction of that started on the 5th of November 2022, and the dungeon's construction began nearly a month later on the 6th of December 2022. This is the first original dungeon idea since the Tomb of Silence 3 years ago. I have a strange fascination with ruins, so I know I wanted to make this upcoming build project ruined. Ruins exist due to abandonment, and because of that, nature creeps in over time. Before beginning, I had to ask myself why this dungeon was abandoned in the first place, and what its purpose was when it was in sound condition. It's when I thought of making it a prison to something. Something significant and big enough that it needs its own dedicated structure to contain it. I settled on a fantastical botanical abomination I called Sylvestum, a plant that spreads its vines periodically, creating light emitting nodes that spreads to more vines and nodes along the way across its environment, creating a lattice and growing forever. The reason I like ruins of structures is because of the history behind why they became the way they are and my wonder of what it could have looked like when it was still in use. Applying that line of thinking to this dungeon, time travel was introduced in the form of a mirrored, intact copy of the dungeon and a portal you walk through midway connecting past and present versions of the dungeon. I smartly kept the dungeon size small, since I knew ahead of time I was going to be doubling my workload. I initially wanted more interactions between the past and present versions, but due to the deadline of the anniversary event coming up, I had to hurry up to get to other things. I'm not sure of the dungeon's finish date, but the closest I can narrow it down to was thanks to a screenshot taken on the 7th of April, 2023. Whew, that is it. The complete history of every single dungeon I have made up to this point. I'm glad you made it this far, and I thank you all for watching. I will see you all next time.